So in this video, we're going to take a look at my tennis serve. I chose a tennis serve because it's something that I need to be able to do well in each one of my matches and even at practice. So once you can perfect or even just become really good at a serve, you'll be able to place the ball in a place where your opponent is either not going to be able to get it or in a place of their weakness. So to their forehand or to their backhand, out wide or down the middle, and that's going to give you an edge on each opponent, especially playing at a higher level. In this video, we're going to look at my 4 phases, and then we're going to concentrate on the one of them, and we're also going to take a look at a couple injuries that could happen in that one phase that we're going to concentrate mainly on. But I just want to take you through each of my phases. So quickly here, we have stance loading. So it's going to start when my hands are kind of together. You can see that in this video really well. So I start about here, and then it's going to end with my arm being perpendicular to the ground. So you can see that in this video up here a lot better. So that's stance loading. Swing loading is going to be from here until I get to these 90-degree angles that you can kind of see. So my wrist and my racket form approximately a 90-degree angle. My forearm and upper arm form approximately a 90-degree angle. Forearm and torso approximately 90-degree angle. So there, and then we're going to go into stance and swing unloading. So that's going to be right here till right before I contact the ball. This video you can see that really well. This one's right after I contact the ball. Once I contact the ball, contact phase ends kind of when I'm giving myself a hug. There you can see that. I'm giving myself a hug. Alright, so let's back up to the swing phase, because this is the one that we're going to look at. So there we have arm perpendicular. First joint we're going to look at is my subtalar joint. So subtalar, you can either have eversion or inversion. I actually start in eversion because I'm weight bearing. Once I become less or almost non-weight bearing, I go to a more neutral position. Eversion to neutral is going to give me a lateral glide. The physiological and accessory movements are both in the frontal plane, and my movement driver is my hips. Moving on to talocrural. So I'm going to have either dorsiflexion or plantar flexion. You can see right here I'm going to start in dorsiflexion and move into plantar flexion. So I move into plantar flexion, and then the accessory movement that happens is a posterior glide. The physiological accessory movements are both in the sagittal plane, and the movement driver again is my hips. Next up, my knee joint, tibiofemoral. So I'm going to start in extension. You can see that really well in this video down here. So extension, as I move through, flexion, boom, right there. This one too, you can see that a little bit. And there's flexion. Alright, so with flexion is going to be a posterior roll and an anterior glide. The physiological and accessory movements are both in the sagittal plane. Movement driver again is my hips. Patellofemoral. So that's just kind of following along with what my knee just did. So extension to flexion. Because of that, my patella is going to be pulled down towards my toes. So that's going to give me an inferior glide. Physiological and accessory movements are both again in the sagittal plane. With each of these movements, there are external forces that act upon them. So ground reaction force, gravity, momentum. Ground reaction force really only gives me that first one because that's when I'm stepping down. So that step down, ground reaction force, is giving me eversion in my subtalar joint. Ground reaction force giving me dorsiflexion in my talocrural joint. Momentum is what is going to give me plantar flexion. As my knee pulls forward, there's momentum that gives me plantar flexion. Alright, so moving up the chain a little bit to the coccipitofemoral joint. So my hips. So I actually start in extension, external rotation, and slight abduction, and I'm going to move into flexion, internal rotation, and increased abduction. So with extension, I'm going to have an anterior roll and a posterior glide. Internal rotation is going to be a lateral roll, medial glide, and abduction is superior roll, inferior glide. So just to show you abduction real quick, you can see right now I am on the right side of that line. As I play it forward, I'm going to end up more on the left side of that line. So, and that toe, I'll just mark it real quick. My toe is staying in that same position. So if you watch here, toe doesn't move, but the rest of me does. That's going to give me abduction. And as I end here, I'm kind of toe out a little bit, so that's going to give me that, or I apologize, I'm toe in, so that's going to give me internal rotation when I started in external rotation, because I'm toe out right here. Alright, the physiological movements and the accessory movements, they're all in the same planes of motion. So flexion is sagittal, internal rotation, transverse, abduction is frontal. So the accessory movements that are happening at flexion, internal rotation, and abduction, all the same planes. The movement driver for this is going to be my knee and my ankle, because it's kind of pulling those hips around. Alright, so next we're going to look at lumbar and thoracic spine together because they're doing the exact same things. So I'm going to start in kind of a neutral position, so you can see that right here, neutral. And then what's going to happen is I'm actually going to move into extension, right lateral flexion, and right rotation. So we'll be able to see the rotation really well in this video down here. So if you watch my shoulder, you'll be able to see that come back. So that's what that right rotation is. And then in this video up here, you can already see right lateral flexion and extension happening. You can see extension happening here too. Extension. So with these, in the L and T spine, extension facets are approximating. Right lateral flexion, right facets are approximating, left facets are gapping. Right rotation, right facets are gapping, and left facets are approximating. Planes of motion, so these again are going to be the same. So extension is sagittal, lateral flexion is frontal, right rotation is transverse. So accessory, so the ones happening for each of those are going to be in the same planes and not going to change. Cervical spine is a little bit different than L and T spine for this video because my eyes are tracking a ball. If I would have done this without the ball, my C-spine would probably be following exactly what my L and T spine are doing. But because I'm following that ball is why I have something slightly different. So you can see that when I start, I actually have a little bit of left lateral flexion and left rotation happening, slight extension already, because this shoulder is up. So it's kind of giving me that flexion. As I move through, you're going to see I look up, so that's giving me increased extension, and my head turns slightly, so that's going to give me left lateral flexion and left rotation. So with this extension, the facets are approximating, left lateral flexion, the left facets are approximating, the right facets are gapping, left rotation, the left facets are gapping, and the right facets are approximating. So physiological movements, again, same thing. So extension sagittal, lateral flexion frontal, left rotation is transverse. Accessory movements, exact same thing. So each of these movements in the LTC spine are weight bearing because both my feet are on the ground. There's really no left and right side. We're going to look at this as a whole. And the movement drivers for these, so my L spine is my hips, T spine is my shoulders, C spine is my eyes. Alright, moving on to the elbow. So my elbow, I'm going to start in extension. So you can see this. No flexion there. As I move through, right here is where I start getting elbow flexion. Elbow flexion. Again, this is back to the 90-90 thing. So with elbow flexion, there's going to be an anterior roll and an anterior glide. The physiological movement is flexion in the sagittal plane, and accessory movement is also in the sagittal plane. This is non-weight bearing, and the movement driver is my hand. My glenohumeral joint, part of my shoulder complex. So my shoulder, I'm going to have my GH, AC, SC, and ST joints. So we're going to look at these kind of as a whole. It's a little bit easier to just look at all the movements happening right away. So I'm going to start in pure abduction right there. That's abduction. I'm going to move to extension, external rotation, and increased abduction. So you're going to see increased abduction. As my racket comes down, that's giving me external rotation, and it's also giving me a little bit of extension. So what's happening with each of these at my glenohumeral joint? Abduction is an inferior glide, extension is a superior glide, external rotation is a lateral spin. This is where the physiological and accessory movements change a little, so I'll read them all. So physiological, abduction is frontal, extension is sagittal, external rotation is transverse. Accessory movements, the movements for abduction and extension are both frontal, and external rotation is still transverse. The movement driver for this is my hand, and we're still non-weight bearing on my hands. Next up is my AC joint, acromioclavicular joint. So again, we have those same movements. So we have abduction is elevation, extension is also elevation, external rotation is a posterior glide. So physiological movements still the same. Abduction, frontal, external rotation, transverse, extension, sagittal. Accessory movements, the movement for abduction is frontal, extension is frontal, and external rotation is sagittal now. Still non-weight bearing, and my movement driver is my hand. So next up is my scapular thoracic joint. So again, same movement. Abduction is going to be upward rotation. Extension is going to be elevation of the anterior tip. External rotation is diaphragm sternum. So physiological movements, again, same thing. Accessory movements, the movement for abduction is frontal, so is the movement for extension. External rotation is in the transverse plane again. Last one we have is the sternoclavicular, the SC joint. So again, same movements, all are in the same planes of motion. The accessory movements are abduction is depression, as well as extension. Those are both depression. External rotation is an anterior glide. So the physiological movements, again, same plane of motion. Accessory movements, abduction is in the frontal plane, extension is in the frontal plane, external rotation is in the sagittal plane. Again, non-weight bearing, my hand is still the movement driver. Alright, so we've looked at everything on the right side. Now we're going to look at everything on the left side. So, subtalar joint. So we're going to start from neutral because I don't have a lot of weight on that foot, so it's pretty much neutral, and we're going to go to eversion. That is going to give us a medial glide. Physiological and accessory movements are both in the frontal plane. Again, we have partial weight bearing to weight bearing, so we'll move this through just to show you. There we go. You can even see it right there. I kind of rock on my feet. Take a look. Rocking on my feet. So partial weight bearing to weight bearing, and my movement driver is going to be my hips. Talocrural joint. So I'm going to go from dorsiflexion to slight plantar flexion back to dorsiflexion. So let's watch this on this video down here. So as I start here, I have a little bit of dorsiflexion. Then I'm going to kind of go down. I have slight plantar flexion. But then as I come through, I'm going to go back to dorsiflexion because I'm putting weight back on that foot. So because I have going back to dorsiflexion, I'm going to have a lateral glide. Physiological and accessory movement. Physiological movement is in the sagittal plane. Accessory movement is in the frontal plane. Again, I'm partial weight bearing to weight bearing, and the movement driver is my hips. Tibiofemoral, so my knee. So I go from slight flexion to extension. So we're going to look at this video. So you're going to watch that left leg. So I have slight flexion right there, and I'm going into extension right there. This is actually where we're going to look at one of the injuries that could potentially happen, or just something biomechanically that's not going exactly right. So what should actually be happening here is I'm going to start in flexion, move to extension, and then continue back into flexion. I don't do that. This is mainly because I am compensating for muscle tone I don't have in my left leg right now since surgery on my ACL. But as we see, I'm completely straight leg into there, so I'm actually stressing ligaments and muscles that I don't need to. I should be bending back into flexion, and this would actually give me a lot more power if I would. So what's actually happening is not only am I stressing things in my leg, I'm also stressing things in my arm because I'm trying to hit harder to compensate for the power that I'm not getting from my legs anymore. So this is one thing that I really need to improve upon. It's something that I used to have that I don't have anymore. So again, from slight flexion into extension, you're going to have an anterior roll with a posterior glide. Physiological and accessory movements are both in the sagittal plane. Going from partial weight bearing to weight bearing with my hips as the movement driver. Patellofemoral joint, because we're going from flexion to extension, flexion again was pulling my patella down, so extension is going to be letting it come back up. So it's going to be a superior glide. Physiological and accessory. Physiological movement is in the sagittal plane. Accessory movements and also in the sagittal plane. And with these, we have external forces, ground reaction force, gravity, and momentum. So we see the momentum. What actually should be happening in this bottom video is momentum should be taking me back down into almost a squat. But I'm not letting it. I'm kind of locking out my knee right there. Alright, so moving up. Hip on my left side. So we can see this down here. So I'm starting in flexion and external rotation, and I'm going to neutral or slight extension with external rotation and adduction. So we're going to start here. So I have slight external rotation and I have flexion. As I move through, I have extension kind of in neutral, external rotation, and a little bit of adduction. We're going to see that in this video up here. So as I move through, we kind of did the hips before. So this is going to move actually in my left leg into a deduction, whereas moving my right leg into a abduction is going to move my left leg into a deduction. So extension is going to be an anterior glide with a posterior roll. External rotation is a medial roll, and adduction is an inferior roll. Planes of motion, extension is sagittal, external rotation is transverse, adduction is frontal, and same for the accessory movements. Those are all the same. again, partial weight bearing to weight bearing, and my movement driver is going to be my lower leg. Lumbar and thoracic spine. So, talked this before, how we're going to look at them at the same time because they're doing the exact same things. So, we'll highlight this again. So, my lumbar and thoracic spine are going to go from neutral to right rotation, extension, and right lateral flexion. So, this is the exact same as the last one that we just talked about. So, we're actually going to skip these for now. They were talked about on the right side. The elbow on my left arm is going to be an extension for almost the entire time. So when I throw the ball up, my arm doesn't bend. It stays an extension the whole time. So I'm just staying in extension. So initially when it moved from flexion to extension, there was a posterior roll with a posterior glide, and both of these are in the sagittal plane. It's non-weight bearing, and my hand is the movement driver. So hand, or almost the ball, you could call the movement driver. The glenohumeral joint. So again, we're going back to my shoulder. So I'm going up. So I'm going from flexion to abduction. Watch that here. Come straight down into abduction. So what's happening is an inferior glide. Both planes of motion for accessory and physiological movements are frontal. It's non-weight bearing. My hand is the movement driver. For the AC joint, again, I'm going from flexion to abduction, so I'm going to have elevation at this joint, and the planes of motion are both frontal again, non-weight bearing, and my hand is the movement driver. SC joint, we're going to have depression at this joint. Again, that's a frontal plane motion, so physiological and accessory are both frontal plane motions. Non-weight bearing, hand is still the movement driver. Scapular thoracic, I'm going to have flexion abduction with upward rotation of that scap. And so the physiological movement is frontal, and the accessory movement is actually in the transverse plane because there's rotation happening. It's non-weight bearing, and my hand is the movement driver. So those are all the ones we needed to look at. And I'll just go ahead and play through my serve so you can see. But that's all we had to look at. Thanks for watching.